Hello, Mark Leslie here with Free Friday Frights for Friday, February 22nd, 2019. This month it's going to be a nonfiction treat, and the nonfiction treat comes from a chapter of the book Haunted Hospitals, which came out a couple of years ago. It was written by myself and Rhonda Parrish. Now, the story in question is from the Canadian section of the book, and it's about chapters Alberta Hospital for the Insane, a woman possessed. And the reason that this is one of the tales that frightens me the most in this particular volume is the way the story was told to me. So because I write paranormal books and books of true ghost stories, I'm often on late night talk radio programs. Usually it's the midnight hour when people want to hear the scary stories. So I was a guest on George Noory's AM Coast to Coast, which is syndicated across the United States. It's a very popular show. He's an amazing host. Been on his show a couple of times. But this one particular time, I was on from midnight Eastern Standard Time till it was either 2 or 3 a.m. It was quite a long show. And in part of the show, we were talking about ghost stories and some of the different things I'd written in the books. And there was a segment of the show where people will call in and share stories with us. And this one caller, who we will call Pat, like I do in the chapter in the book, and I'm going to refer to Pat as a male, as a he, but Pat could be a man, Pat could be a woman. Pat was somebody who worked at this Ponoka Hospital. And Pat called in to relay this tale live on the radio. And I remember sitting in my apartment. I was living in Hamilton, Ontario at the time, and listening to Pat tell this story. And I was frightened. I was by myself. I was a little bit scared. And that story stuck with me. So I ended up, after the call was over, I asked George, or George's producer, if I could get in contact with this Pat, so that Pat could then relay the tale to me in a little bit more detail so I could use it in the book. And Pat did, and I've kept Pat's identity obviously a secret, but I wanted to share the tale. And so in a nutshell, I'm just going to share the high-level details. So Pat was working in this hospital. So the Ponoka Institute, just to give you a bit of a history, was originally founded in 1911. It quickly became the premier mental health institution in the province of Alberta, Canada. And this story was relayed to me in 2015. So it goes back to when Pat had been working there. And Pat worked obviously a lot of different shifts, as you often do when you're working at the hospitals. And Pat, there was a woman in the hospital, let's just call her Mary. Mary was a woman who had basically lived her entire life institutionalized, and wasn't very, didn't talk a lot. And there were some weird things that happened with Mary over time. And one of the initial ones was Mary would complain that it was so freezing cold in the room she was in. And when the staff went in to check, there's like, oh my God, it was freezing. It was like an ice box in her room. And there was nothing wrong with the heaters. Everything was fine. The vents were fine. They ended up moving her to another room. And the room that she vacated, usually about an hour later, was perfectly normal temperature. And the new room she got put into was freezing cold. That was eerie in and of itself. It was something they couldn't explain, and it happened a few times. But the tale that kind of got to me, that really disturbed me, was this one evening when Pat had heard some voices coming out of Mary's room and went to go check. So Mary was in a particular room that had a bit of a curtain over the window, so it was basically to prevent too much stimulus from light and things from outside from annoying or bothering the patients, particularly if they could get agitated easily. And so when Pat got into the room, he opens the door, he steps into the door, and he's expecting to see Mary, like talking to someone. What he sees is Mary is sleeping. She's fast asleep, but she's standing across the room. But she's standing about 4 feet off the floor and she's horizontal with her feet on the wall and her head out into the middle of the room, and her hair was hanging down, and she was completely still. And he said he walked into the room, he pulled the curtains aside, he saw that. He stood there for a second, had no idea what he was seeing. He couldn't conceive of what he was seeing. Stepped back, closed the curtain, closed the door, went back into the room where the other staff were sitting there and watching late night television. Didn't say anything to anyone until in 2015, Pat called in to the show to share that story, that he could not explain it. It freaked him out more than anything. He had also mentioned a couple times that they weren't sure what to do with Mary in this particular hospital because the strange things were constantly happening. And it wasn't until a couple weeks after Pat had called into the show and shared this story with me that Pat was having coffee with a colleague who Pat used to work with at the hospital. And Pat said, you know, I've never told anyone the story, but I was on this radio program and I shared this tale. And then Pat's friend said, funny you should mention that, because one night when I was checking in on Mary, I walked into the room and I saw her sleep standing the way you did, except instead of, floating sideways in the air with her feet on the wall, she was standing, facing towards me. Her eyes were open, but I could tell she wasn't conscious. She was asleep. And what she looked when she looked when this hospital staff person went into the room, they said Mary was standing about 2 or 3 inches off the ground. Her feet were actually elevated, so she was basically floating in a different position, just standing there in her sleep in the middle of the night. And again, that was something that had not been relayed to anyone until Pat had shared this story. And I find it's kind of funny, because sometimes when you see strange things, when you see something you can't explain and you don't understand, it's really easy to assume that, yeah, you're overtired, maybe you saw something strange, and it was just a freaky sort of situation. But then sometimes someone else saw something very similar, and then you wonder, did I actually, was I hallucinating, or did I actually see something strange that we can't explain? So that's the story from that particular book. I see that there's comments here. Joel from hey Dallas, Texas. I hope it's nice and warm in Dallas, Texas. It's Waterloo, Ontario here, and it's a chilly winter. So I'm looking forward to getting back down south. Joel also says, sounds like a patient my mother knew in a nursing home. Kept walking out of his room and asking what time it was, and after a few hours passed, they noticed he didn't come out of his room, so they went to check on him, and he'd passed away in bed after just laying down. That's kind of creepy. So people, after he had passed away, people kept seeing him coming in and out of the room. Yeah, there's so many strange tales, which is why Rhonda and I collected them together in Haunted Hospitals, because we found that there were tales that people wanted to share. Interestingly enough, one of the bars that I hang out at in Hamilton, Ontario, there's some staff members who work at the local hospital, and as I mentioned I was going to be working on the book, I remember them saying, oh, I've got some stories to tell you. So then, when I showed up with my notepad and recorder and said, okay, tell me some stories, they said, yeah, I'd rather not. I said, I won't say who you are. We'll keep you as an anonymous source. But they're like, nah, I'd rather not say that. So it is interesting because, again, you have to think about confidentiality issues and patients and things like that. So you have to be very, very careful about those types of tales. And we did our best to be very careful in terms of relaying things. And Joel, thank you for the comments again. It says, love your bookshelves. Thank you so much. Lots of skulls. Actually, Barnaby is hanging over in the corner there. I usually have him behind me. There's Barnaby the skeleton, but he is usually hanging behind me. I just didn't get a chance to move him. But yeah, lots of fun books there and lots of skulls. So Joel, thanks for the comments. Thanks for joining me on the Free Friday Frights. If you want to read the full story, you can go to markleslie.ca/Free Friday Frights. And every month I do a different free fright. This fright was a nonfiction one, and next week it will be a fiction tale. The tale will be there to read for the full month, and usually on the day that I post it, I usually do a Facebook Live video here on the Mark Leslie Facebook author page. Thanks for joining me for Free Friday Frights. Here's hoping that you're having a fantastic Friday wherever you are, including balmy Dallas, Texas. And hope you have a fantastic weekend. Have a great night.